Hello and welcome to my Sonic Adventure 3 series. These are conceptual videos that focus around how the adventure design philosophy can be re-energized and brought back to the forefront of the modern Sonic experience. A key objective of this series is to equip a core cast of Sonic characters with gameplay reminiscent of the adventure era to provide an engaging experience whilst not having to rely on 2D segments of any kind in order to prove 3D Sonic does not need to revert as hard as we have seen in the modern era. That all said and done, let's discuss what I have planned for our friendly twin-tailed fox.
Time to jam!
Tails has seen a fair amount of playability during the early 3D Sonic titles, but he is in fact one of the hardest characters to design for in the series. That might sound like a strange claim to some of you, especially considering how core Tails is to the series, but getting him to work in a 3D environment proved to be an immense challenge. In the classics, which obviously were in 2D, Tails could get away with being mostly Sonic, except that sometimes he could fly. The levels still worked for Tails, as he used the same framework as Sonic, and his flight was restricted through his energy as well as the geometry. When the level allowed Tails to fly for longer, it was usually attributed to how Tails was seen as an easy mode to Sonic's normal difficulty. Sonic Adventure sought to adapt this version of Tails into the third dimension, but as you all know, he ended up having a different playstyle to Sonic, with the goal of beating Sonic, or Eggman, in a race. A huge factor that likely contributed to this decision was that in 3D, Tails was completely ignoring or downright breaking the level design of stages built for Sonic. Just playing the game for yourself can make this apparent, as there are far less ways to box Tails in. As such, making the stages into a race was really the only thing the developers could do if they wanted Tails to keep his traditional qualities. In SA2, they made him a mirror to Eggman's playstyle instead of using his own, as not only would this make sense for his character, it also meant that Tails could have a more structured stage design without the worry of abuse by flight. Sonic 06 attempted to bring back SA1 Tails, but his implementation tells me that they didn't find much success. Instead of having Tails flow with stage design, they shot his flight in the legs and tied some bricks to his feet. They also made it hard for him to gain speed, and most importantly, only made him playable in small chunks of stages rather than having a dedicated story. This was less of a fix and more of a way of avoiding the underlying problem. Tails just wasn't made with 3D gameplay in mind. I mean, none of the originals were, but their core aspects translate just fine. Tails was Sonic with flight, and whilst the limitations of 2D meant that he could act as an easy mode, 3D made him more of a 3-win button. It's rather telling that although Tails has been present throughout the 2010s, he has not once been made playable. 2D sections would help Tails quite a bit, but this series is about a purely 3D adventure experience. I was aware of these issues going in, however, as I already contemplated these failings in a video on Tails a while back, so feel free to check it out if you wish to hear more. As for the here and now, my goal for Tails is to create a playstyle which still harkens back to his roots of sharing Sonic's core experience, whilst not shying away from the issues witnessed in the adventure era in order to try and carve a familiar yet different gameplay structure for Tails. One method would be to follow in 06's footsteps and heavily limit Tails' capacity for flight. I chose not to do this though, for he may as well not fly in the first place if I don't want players to use it. Instead, I'll be trying to reduce the overall impact of flight in a less direct manner. We will be using the Xbox controller as a reference for control schemes in this video. Moving the left thumbstick causes Tails to move in turn. With the farther away the stick is from center, the faster Tails will move. His walk transitions into a jog almost immediately, and then into being propelled by his tails shortly after that. Changing directions should be snappy regardless of the current speed, unless you were to make a 180 degrees turn, in which Tails will have to skid to a halt first. His top speed would likely be the same as Sonic's outside of boosting. The A button will cause Tails to jump when pressed. Holding it down will lead to a higher jump with a slower fall compared to tapping it. Jumps can harm enemies and interactive items. Movement whilst jumping should be as responsive as with the Sonic Adventure titles. Whilst airborne, tapping the A button again will cause Tails to take flight. Flying will operate closer to its appearance in Sonic 3 rather than in SA1. Next to the ring counter is an energy wheel. Each time the A button is pressed during flight, Tails will climb a little higher and expend a chunk of his energy. Even when not tapping A, whilst flying, the energy meter will gradually deplete as Tails slowly descends. Mashing the A button will allow Tails to reach higher up, but the energy cost will cause him to finish flying quickly. Using the A button sparingly will allow Tails to remain flying for longer, but he will not be able to reach as high. Hopefully this will play a part in allowing level design to account for Tails' options. If Tails runs out of energy whilst flying, he'll become winded, decreasing in altitude rapidly. Until Tails hits the floor or receives damage, the only action the player can do is move. Tails will not regenerate energy until he lands on solid ground or collects an energy refill item. Energy recharges in about 3 seconds from touching the ground. Tapping X in the air will cancel whatever Tails was doing and perform a tail swipe. Only one tail swipe can be performed per jump, but if it hits an item or an enemy, Tails will gain height and can tail swipe again. Pressing the B button will cause Tails to uncurl from a ball or stop flying, whilst also cancelling his current momentum to help with positioning. As for grounded options, pressing the X button will cause Tails to swipe with his tails. This hack keeps Tails standing, so it may be more beneficial when trying to target lots of enemies that are not in a straight line. Pressing B button will rev up a spin dash just like with Sonic. Tapping B whilst moving will cause Tails to curl into a ball, or uncurl if he already was in one. Whilst in a ball, Tails will be greatly influenced by slopes and momentum physics. So that is Tails' core control scheme. Nothing overly complicated, simply my attempt to better balance his SA1 gameplay. With those controls alone though, Tails is still at risk of having stages either feeling empty or that are easily skipped. Part of alleviating this will be down to the structure of the levels themselves, which we will discuss later. The other aspect I have introduced to combat this problem is nothing other than the trusty tornado. The tornado has been around for almost as many adventures as Tails has, and it is a very fitting addition to his character. The tornado will be operable for sections of Tails' stages, much like how Tails himself was playable in sections of Sonic stages in 06. It comes in 3 variations with their own controls, which we will go over now. Starting with something familiar, we have the Mech Tornado formula as seen in Sonic Adventure 2. Tails will control the tornado's combat form, moving with the left thumbstick. Unlike regular Tails, the walker takes a bit of time to build speed and slows down whilst turning, simulating the clunkier build. Pressing the A button causes the walker to jump, but naturally this does not enter a ball form, thus you are susceptible to damage. You can still land on items though. Pressing the X button causes Tails to shoot a projectile forwards, just like in SA2. Holding X down will instead activate a targeting laser, which once released will fire homing shots on anything it painted. Pressing the B button makes Tails stomp, causing damage in a small area around Tails, even to things not touching the ground. In the air, pressing B does nothing. Also in the air, holding the A button will cause the walker to hover as it gradually descends. In addition, taking damage as the mech will work slightly differently than from SA2. Instead of building up a HP meter, the mech simply loses rings in chunks of 15 per hit. This still maintains the tanky feeling, but streamlines the HP a bit. The next form is the Plane Tornado. Think of this as an expanded version of the tornado sections within Sonic Adventure. The tornado is played like an on-the-rails experience, wherein you are constantly moving forwards through the air. The left thumbstick will reposition the tornado on the screen, whilst the right thumbstick moves your targeting reticle. The right trigger will fire a chain gun, and the left trigger will fire a homing shot if held down over a target for a second. The homing shot explodes in a wide area, so it can be useful in crowded situations. Whilst the A button is held, the tornado will boost forwards. Last but not least is the kart tornado. This form takes inspiration from the karts featured in SA2 and Sonic Heroes. Typically, you will be traversing a racetrack or obstacle course when playing a kart section. Holding the A button acts as the accelerator. The B button is a brake, but becomes the reverse when you are not moving forwards. The left thumbstick can be used to steer the kart, but it doesn't turn on a dime. For sharper, more sudden turns, the left and right triggers can be pressed to activate the drift, in a direction corresponding to the trigger held. Whilst airborne, the triggers can be pressed to perform a trick that will grant a boost of speed upon landing. After collecting 40 rings, a boost charge is stored. Pressing the Y button will use up a stored boost charge to gain a burst of speed for a few moments. It might help to imagine the kart section in Sonic Generations as a base, and then add my features on top and place them in a larger kart focused area. These different forms of the tornado can be placed carefully throughout a Tails story to help give him stages less easily cheesed, whilst also helping the player feel like they're playing a genius with machines. Some levels may only use one of these, some may use multiple. A stage could start with Tails flying the tornado over a jungle, but the treetops are set on fire, forcing Tails to take to the ground on foot. The fire above would also mean Tails can fly, but has to be careful not to go too high into the fire. This setting would also allow for falling trees, fire hazards, panicked enemies, etc. Something like that should make an engaging Tails stage. Of course, I think Tails should have one stage where he doesn't use any of his machines. It could be a more Sonic-styled action mission, but certain checkpoints require something off the beaten path to be collected in order to progress further into the stage. Assuming the level is also competently designed, this structure would allow Tails to still replicate the Sonic Speed type of gameplay without having his flight drastically nerfed, and then the exploration to progress will take full advantage of his flight as a necessity rather than as a shortcut. If the stage is vertical, perhaps some real shortcuts in the stage could be unlocked so that Tails can easily move back and forth and complete objectives blocking his way. This type of level might prove more popular than the ones that include the machines, but since I have no way of knowing, I will keep it to one stage for now. Currently, I would imagine that the objective for Tails is to simply reach the end of the stage. Sometimes that might be simple, other times you may need to solve some puzzle or challenge first. Another point of consideration are boss battles. Normal Tails can do fine, but I'm uncertain if I would give any of the Tornado playstyles a boss fight. For character upgrades, I think it's important that Tails does not get anything that would increase the speed, height or duration of his flight. If I have been successful in keeping flying under control, the last thing I would want is to ruin it with an upgrade. Instead, his upgrade should focus more on utility, such as bringing the warrior ribbon back from SA1 so that Tails may Beyblade to victory once again. And that just about wraps up my ideas for how I would bring Tails back into the playable roster, whilst giving him an adventure faithful playstyle and avoiding 2D. Tails is probably the character I am least sure about thus far. I was even debating cutting him out, as before I came to my current solution, it just seemed that he was going to be Sonic with less to do. Regardless, I am glad I finally came up with something, and I hope it would at least improve on the 3D Tails experience, if not solving it outright. What are your thoughts on the matter? Maybe there is a feature that I've missed out. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching and have a great day. This is the Mighty Emperor, signing off.